Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. They say curiosity killed the cat, but I never thought my own would lead me into a darkness so deep I'd lose sight of my own reality. It all started with an innocent dare, a challenge from my friends to explore the hidden realms of the internet. I didn't go into it blindly. I knew enough about the dangers of the dark web, the horror stories circulating the internet, the unsettling true crime anecdotes, and the occasional urban legend that seemed to linger in the corners of every forum. But I thought I could handle it. I thought it was just an anonymous corner of the web, a place where people went to buy drugs or share conspiracy theories. I was wrong. I'll tell you this now. The dark web isn't just a hidden place on the internet. It's a world unto itself, filled with shadows, nightmares, and something else. Something alive. It was around midnight on a chilly October night when I first logged in. My room was dark, the only light coming from my laptop screen. I had covered my webcam, dimmed the brightness, and taken all the standard precautions to keep myself hidden. I navigated through Tor, the browser of choice for this kind of exploration, and found myself staring at a search bar. There was a thrill in that moment, a rush of adrenaline I hadn't felt in a long time. With a deep breath, I typed in "true horror experiences," figuring it was as safe a starting point as any. What came up were strange, cryptic links, most of them just strings of random letters and numbers. But one caught my eye, a site called The Dark Journal. The page loaded slowly, as if something was actively fighting me back, resisting my attempt to see its contents. When it finally opened, a single line of text filled the screen. "You do not find horror. Horror finds you." I'll admit, a chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off, chalking it up to late-night paranoia. Beneath the text was a link titled, "True Stories of Terror. Enter if you dare." Without a second thought, I clicked. The site was bare bones, with nothing but walls of text written in tiny, typewriter-style font. There were story titles like "The Man in the Mask," "Voices in the Void," and "The Room with No Doors." They sounded like typical horror stories, but the descriptions hinted at something darker, something more personal. And then, just as I was about to scroll, a message appeared at the bottom of the screen. "Hello, Oliver." I froze. My name wasn't connected to this account. There was no way anyone could have known who I was. Heart pounding, I looked around my room as if someone might be watching me. "Who is this?" I typed, my hands trembling. The response was immediate. "I am the collector of fear. I am the keeper of truths that others dare not speak. You wanted horror, Oliver, let me show you." Before I could even think to close the tab, my screen went black. Then a video player popped up. A dimly lit room appeared on the screen, one that looked eerily familiar. I squinted, my mind racing. The layout was the same as mine. The same bed, the same desk, even the same posters on the wall. It was my room. The camera tilted slightly, showing the desk. I saw myself, sitting there, looking around as if someone were behind me. The me on the screen suddenly looked at the camera. No, it felt like it was looking directly at me, as if the two of us were somehow connected across time and space. My own reflection in the laptop screen wavered, aligning perfectly with the figure on the screen. A voice, raspy and cold, whispered from my speakers. "How far are you willing to go, Oliver? How much do you want to see?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to exit, but a twisted curiosity held me in place. I couldn't look away. I typed, hands shaking, "What are you? I am the one who knows what you truly fear." And just like that, The camera view switched to a dark hallway, one that looked ancient, with peeling walls and flickering lights. At the end of the hallway, there was a door slightly ajar. Shadows moved within, their shapes unnatural and jerky, like broken marionettes. The camera moved forward, creeping toward the door, every creak and groan amplified through my speakers. I found myself leaning closer, my pulse racing, but the closer the camera got, the more I realized. I recognized that door. The frame was chipped in the same way as the door down my own hallway. I swallowed hard, the unease growing. Suddenly, the screen went dark again, replaced by a new video player. It showed a close-up of a phone screen with a contact labeled unknown. The phone began to ring. I felt the vibration in my own pocket. Hesitantly, I reached down and pulled out my phone. The screen was blank, no calls or messages, but the one on the video kept ringing. "Pick up the phone, Oliver," the text on my screen said. I wanted to shut my laptop, to turn away from whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into, but I felt compelled, as if some unseen force was guiding my hands. The phone in the video stopped ringing. Instead, I saw a message. "Check the closet." A sinking feeling overtook me. My closet was directly behind me, barely 5 feet away. I spun around in my chair, heart pounding. The door was slightly ajar. "Oliver, are you brave enough to look?" My blood ran cold as I realized the question was waiting for an answer on my screen. My fingers barely felt the keys as I typed. "Number." The response was instant, appearing in bold, black letters on my screen. "The door is opening, whether you want it to or not." I could hear the soft creak from behind me, the unmistakable sound of wood bending and giving way. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body remained frozen in place. I glanced over my shoulder, my pulse thundering in my ears. The closet door was now wide open, revealing nothing but darkness within. I could barely make out shapes, as though someone or something was shifting in the shadows, waiting, watching. A new line of text appeared on my screen, accompanied by a chilling image. A figure cloaked in darkness standing just behind me. The caption read, "Turn around, Oliver. They're here." My skin prickled as I whipped around, half expecting to see something reach out from the shadows. But my room was empty. No figure, no sound, just silence. My laptop screen flickered and another message appeared. "You wanted horror, Oliver. Now, horror has found you." With that, my laptop shut off, the screen going completely black, casting the room into darkness. I sat there, paralyzed, barely breathing, as the silence pressed down on me. And then, my phone vibrated once more. The message was simple, just 2 words. "Look outside." Trembling, I moved to my window. I pulled back the curtain, my heart racing faster than ever. Outside, in the dim light of the street, I saw a figure standing, their face obscured by shadow. They tilted their head, almost in a mocking invitation, as though daring me to join them. And then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, they vanished, leaving me staring at an empty street. It's been days since that night, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The messages still come. No matter what I do, they find me. The dark web may be hidden from most of the world, but now, it's as if I'm the one who's hidden, and something, or someone, is always watching, always waiting. And the worst part, I know I'll never be able to escape. I didn't think much of it the first time the phone rang, just a soft, staticky buzz breaking the stillness of my tiny apartment at 2:07 a.m. I'd been barely asleep, caught in the uneasy lull between REM and the waking world, and for a split second, I thought I was dreaming. But when I reached for the phone, bleary-eyed, the screen flashed the name that froze the blood in my veins. Sarah. It was impossible. My sister had been dead for 3 years. I let it ring, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. The phone buzzed in my hand like a living thing, relentless, insistent. 5 rings, 6, 7. When it finally stopped, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I told myself it was some sick prank, someone hacked her number, some scammer targeting her old contact list. Nothing more. But that night, as I lay back in bed, I couldn't sleep. Sarah's name on my screen lingered like a dark spot burned into my vision, and memories of her flooded back. The way she used to call me every night before she'd fallen into that last spiral. The pain in her voice when she talked about feeling watched by something no one else could see. She'd been so terrified in those last days. At 2:07 the next morning, it rang again. Sarah. This time, I answered. Hello? My voice was little more than a whisper. There was no response, just a faint, static hiss. But beneath it, almost too low to make out, I could hear something. A voice. Her voice, soft and shaky, as if she were trying to speak through layers of cotton. Her words came in fragments, breaking apart as if something were swallowing them. Help, can't find me. The line cut off, and I was left holding the phone in the dark, my pulse thundering in my ears. I told myself it had to be some kind of glitch, a crossed wire or a trick of my exhausted mind. But as the days dragged on, the calls didn't stop. Every night at exactly 2:07, my phone would ring, Sarah's name lighting up the screen like a twisted beacon. Sometimes I'd answer, other times I'd let it go to voicemail, but each time it was the same. Broken words, desperate whispers, and that horrible, suffocating static that made me feel like I was drowning. One night, after a week of sleepless nights and restless, haunted days, I decided to call the number back. I sat in the dark with the phone in my hand, the air thick with anticipation and a sense of dread that seeped into my bones. My fingers trembled as I dialed her number, half expecting it to be disconnected, but the call went through. Sarah, I whispered, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just the same chilling static. I waited, listening, my heart a drumbeat in my chest. And then, faintly, her voice came through. Why didn't you help me? The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd done everything I could for Sarah. I'd listened to her fears, tried to comfort her, even when her mind slipped into paranoia and she'd accused me of ignoring her. But now, hearing her voice, so raw, so broken, I felt a rush of guilt I couldn't shake. Sarah, I tried, I stammered. I didn't know how to help. The line crackled, her voice slipping in and out. I can't get out, I'm trapped. Please, find me. Where are you? I cried, desperation clawing at my throat. Tell me where you are. There was a horrible pause, the static thickening until it felt like it was filling my ears, pressing in from all sides. And then, faintly, I heard her say, home. My breath caught. Our childhood home had been abandoned for years, ever since my parents moved away. It was an old, creaking place on the edge of town, falling apart from neglect and weather. But if Sarah was there, if somehow she was trapped, waiting for me, I went that night. The drive to our old house felt surreal, like stepping into a nightmare. The wind was howling as I pulled up to the sagging structure, its windows dark and vacant, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I stepped out of the car, the cold biting through my clothes, and stood in front of the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't ignore her. Not this time. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the smell of mildew and rot assaulting my senses. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows along the walls that seemed to shift and crawl in the corners of my vision. Sarah? I called, my voice swallowed by the silence. There was no answer, just the creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet and the distant whisper of the wind rattling the broken windows. But then, as I reached the hallway leading to her old bedroom, I heard it. My phone started ringing. The sound echoed through the empty house, loud and jarring, slicing through the stillness like a knife. I pulled it from my pocket, staring at the screen in horror. Sarah. With trembling fingers, I answered, bringing the phone to my ear. "Hello?" My voice was barely a breath. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Her voice was so close, like she was standing right behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty, just a long stretch of shadow and peeling wallpaper. "I'm here now," I said, my voice shaky. "Where are you?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I'm behind you." A chill shot through me, and I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam of light fell on the door at the end of the hall. Her old room. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me forward. I took a step, then another, my heart pounding as I reached out and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust, but the air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. It felt like I'd stepped into a place that wasn't meant for the living. And then, I saw it. A faint outline on the floor. A shadow that seemed to pulse and shift as if it were alive. I took a shaky breath, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something unfathomable. "Sarah?" I whispered. The shadow twisted, forming into something that vaguely resembled a figure. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and dark. She reached out, her hand a blur of darkness and light, and I felt a chill seep into my bones, colder than anything I'd ever felt. "Why didn't you help me?" she murmured, her voice echoing in my head, filling every corner of my mind. I tried," I said, my voice cracking. "I tried, Sarah, I swear I did." Her face twisted, a look of anguish that pierced me to the core. "Then why am I still here?" The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around me, and I felt myself sinking, as if the floor were pulling me down into something I couldn't escape. I tried to scream, to reach out, but my body wouldn't move, frozen in place as the darkness swallowed me, and then, just as suddenly, it was over. I woke up in my car, the morning sun glaring through the windshield. My phone was in my lap, the screen dark. I looked back at the house, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway, watching me. But the house was empty, silent, just an old, decaying structure with no sign of life. When I checked my phone, there were no missed calls, no messages. It was as if none of it had happened, as if the entire night had been a fever dream. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that a part of that darkness was still clinging to me, whispering in the back of my mind. And every night since, at exactly 2:07 a.m., my phone rings. But now, I'm too afraid to answer. I always thought those stories about Ouija boards were just that, stories. Ghost tales you tell to freak out your friends at a sleepover. Until the night I saw something I'll never forget, something that makes me question every shadow, every whisper in the dead of night. It happened last October, just a few days before Halloween. My friend Ava had a fascination with the occult. She wasn't your average, dabble in the spooky stuff kind of person. She was obsessed. Her apartment looked like a scene out of a horror movie, complete with dusty skulls, black candles, and old books she swore were ancient texts on the dark arts. "It'll be fun," she grinned, holding up a board that looked disturbingly well used. The letters and numbers had faded, and the edges were chipped, but the planchette sat right in the middle, untouched, as if it had been waiting for us. I laughed it off, pretending not to be nervous, even as my stomach twisted. It was just a game, right? Nothing to worry about. But when she set it down on her coffee table and dimmed the lights, my laughter died in my throat. "There are a few rules," she said, her voice almost reverent as she explained. "Always say goodbye, and whatever you do, don't take your hands off the planchette until we're done." The other friends with us, Mark and Jenny, exchanged nervous glances but joined us anyway, forming a circle around the board. I could feel a cold draft drifting through the room, though no windows were open. I tried to ignore the chill settling over my skin, chalking it up to nerves, but I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. Ava's eyes gleamed with excitement as she dimmed the last light, and I caught a strange look in her eyes, a look that wasn't entirely her own. "All right, everyone ready?" Ava asked, grinning wide. We nodded, though I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Ava placed her fingers lightly on the planchette, motioning for us to do the same. We all touched it, feeling its smooth, cold surface under our fingertips. Ava started with the typical line, "Are there any spirits here with us tonight?" For a moment, there was nothing, just the silence of the room pressing down on us. But then, the planchette started to move. Slowly, almost reluctantly, it crept over to the word yes. I laughed, uneasy, and glanced at the others. "Come on, one of you is pushing it," I said, trying to break the tension. But they all swore it wasn't them, their faces dead serious. Ava's voice dropped to a whisper. "What is your name?" The planchette didn't move at first. Then it jerked, moving across the board faster than before, spelling out, "ISAAC." Jenny gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't you say this board was, like, from an estate sale or something?" Ava nodded, her eyes glued to the board, almost hypnotized. "The woman I bought it from told me her husband had passed away suddenly. His name was Isaac." A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but something in the air felt heavier, darker, like the room had shifted somehow. I cleared my throat, trying to stay calm. "Maybe we should stop," I muttered. "This feels wrong." But Ava ignored me, her fingers gripping the planchette tighter. "Isaac, do you have a message for us?" The planchette jerked again, more forcefully this time, spelling out LEAVENOW. A chill settled over the room as the words sank in. We all stared at each other, wide-eyed, as the reality of the situation hit us. But Ava just grinned, her eyes alight with something that wasn't entirely sane. "Is that a threat?" she whispered, almost taunting. Suddenly the lights flickered. My heart hammered against my ribs as we looked around, trying to figure out if it was just a power surge or something worse. I wanted to leave, to bolt out of that apartment, but I felt glued to my spot. The planchette began to move again, this time more urgently, spelling out DONOTCONTINUE. "Maybe we should actually listen to it," Mark mumbled, his voice wavering. Ava just shook her head, her face pale but determined. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Isaac, what happens if we don't leave?" This time, the board spelled something else, something that made my blood run cold. SOULS. "What? What does that mean?" Jenny stammered, her voice trembling as the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. I could feel a presence around us, like icy fingers brushing against my skin, as if someone or something was circling, watching, waiting. Ava pushed the planchette toward the center of the board, asking another question, but I had had enough. I jerked my hands away, muttering, "I'm done with this. It's not safe. It's not." She glared at me, but before she could say anything, the planchette started moving on its own, faster than before, whipping across the board in erratic circles. None of us were touching it, and yet it spelled out the word DIE. Mark shot up from the floor, backing away. "All right, I'm out. This isn't funny anymore." And that's when the scratching started. It was faint at first, like the sound of nails scraping against wood coming from the walls. Then it grew louder, surrounding us. The sound became a fevered scratching, faster, more desperate, as if something was trying to claw its way through. I wanted to scream, but fear held me silent. Ava seemed transfixed, her eyes wide with a strange, manic gleam. The planchette moved again, almost violently now, spelling out HELPME over and over, faster and faster until it was a blur. "Isaac," Jenny whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Is that you?" The scratching grew louder, and suddenly the lights went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, with only the faint glow of the candles casting twisted shadows on the walls. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I looked around, hoping this was just some elaborate prank. But then I saw it. A shadowy figure, standing just beyond the circle of candlelight, watching us. Its eyes were empty, black pits, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as it took a step closer. I tried to scream to warn the others, but my voice caught in my throat. The scratching grew to an unbearable level, like 1,000 claws tearing through the walls. I could feel the darkness closing in around us, suffocating, pressing down, as if the very air had turned to smoke. And then, just as suddenly, the scratching stopped. The room was silent, but the figure was still there, looming over Ava, who stared up at it with wide, terrified eyes. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the figure reaching for her, its shadowy fingers wrapping around her neck. When I came to, the room was empty. The candles had burned down to stubs, and the board lay in the center of the table, its planchette shattered. Ava, Mark, and Jenny were gone, their belongings scattered around the room as if they had vanished without a trace. I stumbled out of the apartment, my mind reeling, my heart racing. To this day, I don't know what happened to them or what we unleashed that night. All I know is that I will never, ever go near a Ouija board again. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that scratching. They say you feel it first. A prickle at the base of your neck, a shadow too close, a coldness that doesn't belong. I always laughed it off when people talked about feeling like they were being watched. I used to think it was some instinctual paranoia, a product of watching too many horror movies alone at night. I don't laugh about it anymore. It started on a night I remember in fragments, pieces that feel stitched together in my memory by fear more than any real sense of logic. I'd been at my desk in my tiny one-room apartment, staring at my laptop screen, trying to ignore the persistent hum of the radiator. My apartment wasn't exactly in the best part of town. The building was old, the floors creaked, and I often found strange, unexplainable stains in the hallway. But the rent was low, and it was mine. Most importantly, it was quiet, or it used to be. That night, there was something in the air, something different. The wind had picked up outside, rattling against the windows. Around midnight, I began hearing soft knocks on the wall adjacent to my bed. I brushed it off as the neighbors, probably rearranging furniture or getting a little too enthusiastic in bed. But the knocks didn't stop. They were slow, steady, like a heartbeat, each one perfectly spaced from the next. Then it was my door. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my fingers suspended over my laptop keyboard, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The knocks came again, soft but insistent. I lived alone, and my apartment was on the 3rd floor with a broken intercom system. Nobody should have been able to get up here without me letting them in. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay quiet, not to respond. But curiosity can be deadly. I crept toward the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. I waited a full minute, 2, before letting myself breathe again. Must have been a prank, I told myself. Some neighborhood kid running up the stairs and banging on doors to scare the residents. But even then, I knew it didn't feel like a prank. It felt personal. The next few nights passed without incident, and I began to feel like maybe I'd been overreacting. But just as I was starting to convince myself I'd imagined it, it happened again. I was lying in bed, drifting off when I felt it. That prickle at the base of my neck, like fingers skimming over my skin. I opened my eyes to the dark, every nerve on edge, feeling watched, exposed. I held my breath, staring into the pitch-black room. And then I heard it. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Something was outside my window. I'm 3 floors up, I reminded myself. There's no balcony, nothing anyone could stand on. But the sound persisted, a slow, deliberate dragging noise. I couldn't resist. I got up and walked toward the window, every step weighed down with dread. I pulled back the curtains in one swift motion, heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there, just the empty, dark street below. But the feeling hadn't gone away. I still felt eyes on me, crawling over my skin, and I stumbled back from the window, desperately trying to shake off the sensation. It took hours for me to fall asleep, and even then, I dreamed of those invisible eyes watching me from the shadows, creeping closer. By the end of the week, it was happening every night. The knocks on the door, the sounds outside my window, the feeling of being watched. It was driving me mad. I was exhausted, running on coffee and nerves, constantly looking over my shoulder. I hadn't told anyone, afraid they'd think I was crazy, that maybe I was imagining it. Then one night, I got the message. I was lying on the couch, lights on this time, with a book in my lap, trying to stay awake. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I picked it up without much thought. It was a message from an unknown number. I'm watching you. I dropped my phone, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. My hands shook as I read the message again, feeling the weight of it settle over me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a cruel joke, but deep down I knew it was real. This wasn't random. Someone, or something, had been watching me, waiting, and now it wanted me to know. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife, watching the shadows lengthen as the hours crawled by. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I had a feeling? A few knocks and a weird text? They'd probably dismiss it, tell me to change my number and get some rest. The next few days were a blur. Every time I went outside, I felt like I was being followed. Every person on the street, every shadow in an alley, seemed to be watching me, lurking. I barely ate, barely slept, too afraid to let my guard down. I considered moving, but something told me that it wouldn't matter. This thing, whatever it was, would follow me. It was as if it had attached itself to me, feeding off my fear. One night, when I couldn't take it anymore, I finally did call the police. They sent a pair of officers over, but as I expected, there wasn't much they could do. They took my statement, assured me that they'd keep an eye on my building, and left me alone with the darkness and the silence. I locked every door, every window, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching, waiting. The final night was the worst. I woke up in the middle of the night, the silence in my apartment suffocating. I felt it immediately. Something was in the room with me. I could feel it, standing over me, breathing, filling the air with a rancid stench that made my stomach churn. I was frozen, paralyzed with terror, too afraid to move or even open my eyes. But I didn't need to see it to know that it was there. It leaned down, close enough that I could feel the ice-cold chill radiating off its skin. And then, in a voice that sounded more like a growl than a whisper, it spoke. You belong to me now. A rush of freezing air swept over me, and the presence was gone. But the fear remained, a terror so deep and visceral that it seemed to root itself in my bones. I lay there shaking, too afraid to even breathe, until dawn finally crept in through the window, casting weak light over the room. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't even look back at the building. I moved across the city, changed my number, even got a new job, desperate to leave the nightmare behind. For a while, it seemed to work. I started to sleep again, started to believe that maybe it had been some terrible hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion. But every once in a while, late at night, I still feel it. That prickle at the base of my neck, the whisper of eyes watching me from the darkness. And sometimes, just when I'm starting to believe I'm free, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of something outside my window, 3 floors up. I always thought ghost stories were just that, stories. I used to laugh them off, say they were for people with overactive imaginations. But what happened to me a year ago changed everything. I've spent countless nights since then trying to forget it. But the truth is, some things can't be forgotten. Some things cling to you like cold air in your lungs, never letting go. It started innocently enough, with a second-hand spirit box I'd bought online. My name is Dan, and I was 32 at the time. I had a fascination with paranormal investigation shows, but it was all in good fun. Just an excuse to be scared with my buddies while we laughed at shaky camera angles and jumped at voices that were more static than sound. I didn't actually believe in any of it, so when I stumbled across an old spirit box on an online auction site, I thought, why not? It would be a funny conversation piece. But this box was different from anything I'd seen on TV. The seller claimed it had been used by a professional paranormal investigator, though they gave no specific details. It arrived at my door in a package much heavier than I expected, and when I pulled it out, I saw why. The thing looked ancient, like it had been handmade. Instead of plastic, it was encased in dark wood, worn and scuffed, with a strange metallic symbol etched on the side that I didn't recognize. My first thought was that the thing looked cursed, but I shrugged it off as part of the charm. My first session was more curiosity than anything else. I sat alone in my living room, switched off the lights for ambiance, and powered the box on. Static hissed, filling the air with an unsettling buzz. I started asking random questions, just to amuse myself. Nothing happened, just static and the occasional blip of radio interference. Until I asked, "Is anyone there?" I still get chills remembering that moment. The static cut out sharply, leaving complete silence. I thought the thing had broken, and I was about to shut it off when a faint, crackling voice came through. "Hello." I froze. For a few seconds, I convinced myself it was just interference, some random stray broadcast. But there was something eerie about that voice. It was faint, soft, almost pleading. It sounded human, but there was an unnatural tone to it, like it wasn't meant for human ears. Who are you?" I stammered. Silence. The box crackled. Then the voice returned, closer, louder. "I need help." I blinked, my heart racing. It felt stupid, but I played along. "How can I help you?" There was a pause, and I could almost feel the presence on the other side, hesitating. Then it spoke again, words drenched in a sorrow that chilled me to my core. "He won't let me go." A shiver ran down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but suddenly the box erupted in static, so loud and violent it made me flinch. I scrambled to turn it off, but it was stuck, screeching with a sound that was more like screaming than static. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noise cut out, leaving an unnatural silence that filled the room like thick smoke. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. But something about that voice lingered in my mind. The next day I tried to forget it, chalking it up to my own nerves. But that night, I dreamed about the voice, hearing it whispering, pleading for help. The following night, I turned the box on again. This time I was more direct. "Who won't let you go?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. The voice came back immediately, closer than before. "He watches. He's always watching." The hairs on my arms prickled. I didn't like the way it spoke, like it was seeing something I couldn't. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling watched. "Who's watching?" I whispered. The answer came so faintly, I almost missed it. The shadow. An icy dread settled in my gut. The voice was different this time, more fearful. I wanted to stop, to walk away from this, but some sick curiosity kept me there, clutching the box like it was the only link to a world I didn't want to understand. "What is the shadow?" I asked, though I was terrified to know the answer. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the voice came through again, clear and desperate. "Run, before he sees you." The static exploded once more, and in a panic, I yanked the batteries out. The silence afterward felt heavier, like the voice was still there, watching. I sat on the floor, my hands shaking, staring at the box. I knew I shouldn't have turned it on again, but there was a compulsion, a pull to understand what I was hearing. Over the next few days, I tried to put the spirit box away, but no matter what I did, I kept feeling drawn back to it. The dreams didn't stop. Every night I heard that same voice calling out, whispering my name, begging for help. Finally, one night I couldn't resist any longer. I took the box down to the basement, thinking that maybe if I put some distance between us, it wouldn't feel so close. As soon as I turned it on, the voice came through, stronger and clearer than ever before. "Dan," it whispered, drawing my name out like a plea. My blood ran cold. How do you know my name?" "He knows," the voice rasped. "He's here, watching you." In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed to run. I backed away from the box, but something held me in place, a chill that sank into my bones. I looked around the dim basement, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the oppressive feeling of being watched. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The box crackled, and for the first time, the voice sounded different, closer, colder, and without a trace of fear. "Run." It was no longer a warning, it was a command, spoken in a voice that felt familiar, like my own voice echoing back to me. The air turned thick, almost suffocating. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the box. Then I saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, shifting, creeping along the walls. It didn't have a defined shape, just a formless blackness that felt alive, watching. My breath hitched, and for a split second, I locked eyes with something deep within the darkness. Two pinpricks of light that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. But the feeling of that presence, that shadow, lingered. I could feel it seeping through the walls, creeping closer, feeding on my fear. I left the spirit box down there thinking it would stay trapped in the basement. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. Faint at first, then louder. The static coming from downstairs. Then a voice drifting up the stairs, whispering my name. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed locked in my room, clutching a flashlight like it could ward off whatever was coming for me. But the shadow never showed itself. It didn't have to. Its presence was enough, filling my home, my mind, invading my every thought. The spirit box is still down there. I haven't touched it in months, but I can't bring myself to throw it away. Sometimes I hear it in the middle of the night, calling to me, urging me to come back. I know that voice will haunt me for the rest of my life. Because once you've heard the voices from the other side, they never truly leave. And I'm no longer alone. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just my imagination. It was late at night, and I was trudging down the lonely, dimly lit road that led from my office to my apartment. The street was quiet, save for the faint hum of streetlights overhead. But as I walked, I had that feeling, a crawling, creeping sensation of being watched. You know the one. My skin prickled, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. Nothing. I shook it off, kept walking, but the sensation only grew stronger, as if an unseen pair of eyes were boring into my back. I sped up, my heart pounding in time with my footsteps. Then I saw it, a shadow just out of the corner of my eye. moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. But every time I turned, it melted into the darkness, leaving me alone with only the distant streetlights for company. It happened again the next night. This time I tried to act casually, tried to catch it in my peripheral vision, but it was quick, clever, always slipping just out of sight. And then, one night, it whispered my name. For weeks, this thing, this entity, haunted my every step. The dread gnawed at me, stealing my sleep and making the world seem slightly off-kilter. It was like I'd stepped into some twilight version of my life, where things looked the same but felt disturbingly wrong. Friends and family noticed my jumpiness, the shadows under my eyes. I lied, brushed it off. How could I explain the feeling that something malevolent was stalking me, hiding just beyond the reach of light? I started taking different routes home, anything to shake off the feeling. But it was always there, and it wasn't just on the street anymore. One night, I woke up to the feeling of weight pressing down on my chest, my skin tingling as though I were lying beneath a heavy blanket of static. My room was pitch dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it standing in the corner, half shrouded in darkness. It was a figure cloaked in shadows, with an outline vaguely human, but wrong in subtle ways. Its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My heart hammered painfully in my chest as I lay there, paralyzed, staring at it as it seemed to dissolve into the darkness, fading slowly until the room was empty again. The following day, I went to the library, desperate to find some explanation, some scrap of folklore or history that could explain this thing. Hours of searching led me to an old, dusty book filled with local legends. One chapter detailed accounts of a sinister follower, an entity that, once seen, would latch onto its victim until they broke. Victims described a shadow that followed them, a whisper that grew louder each night, until it finally drove them to madness. The more I read, the more nauseous I felt. Some claimed the sinister follower was born of regret, that it attached itself to people carrying a deep, unspoken guilt or sorrow, feeding off the darkness within them. And once it found someone, it would follow them relentlessly until they couldn't bear it anymore. Regret. That word lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. I hadn't spoken to my brother in years, not since we had a falling out that was as petty as it was final. I'd wanted to reach out a dozen times, to apologize, to mend things, but pride, and maybe fear, had held me back. Now, the possibility that my regret had somehow summoned this thing was almost too much to bear. The nights grew worse. I heard my name echoing in the silence, sometimes from right behind me, sometimes whispering from the shadows in my own apartment. The entity began appearing more frequently, just out of sight, lingering in the shadows of my hallway or at the edge of my bed. One night, it appeared so close, I could feel the cold radiating from it. I forced myself to keep my eyes shut, heart pounding, praying it would leave. But then I felt a hand, a long, thin hand with fingers too many and too cold, brush against my cheek. Its touch left a trail of icy numbness like frostbite spreading slowly across my skin. "Apologize," it whispered, voice like rusted metal grinding against itself. "Apologize." The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I dialed my brother's number, each ring sending a chill down my spine. But when he picked up, the relief in his voice was palpable. We spoke for hours, both of us stumbling over words as we poured out years of pent-up anger, hurt, and apologies. By the time we hung up, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Maybe, just maybe, I had shaken off the shadow. But that night, the entity came back, stronger than ever. I woke up to see it looming over my bed, its distorted face inches from mine, its mouth stretching in a wide, terrible grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. Its eyes were hollow, but I could feel them staring into me, scraping against my soul. "You cannot rid yourself of me," it hissed, voice echoing as if it were coming from a deep, bottomless well. I tried to scream, to thrash, but my body was frozen. It leaned closer, its icy breath spreading across my skin, its voice filling my ears until it was all I could hear, drowning out my own thoughts. "You think you're free, you belong to me now." When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing so fast I could barely breathe. I glanced around, half expecting to see it standing by my bed. But I was alone, if only for the moment. Desperate, I went to see a priest, a last resort I never would have considered before. The priest listened with a solemn expression, as if he'd heard such confessions before. After a long silence, he handed me a small vial of holy water and told me to pray, to cleanse my home of whatever evil had taken root there. That night, I sprinkled the water at every corner of my apartment, murmuring words of prayer and clutching the cross he'd given me like a lifeline. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Then, as I approached my bedroom, the shadows seemed to swell, growing thicker, darker. The entity emerged from the darkness, more solid, more menacing than ever. Its eyes, black, endless voids, locked onto mine. It lunged, mouth wide in a silent scream, its arms stretching out to wrap around me, colder than death itself. "No prayer can save you," it rasped, voice like shards of ice scraping against my mind. "I am bound to you, forever." I stumbled back, clutching the cross, praying harder, louder, as the thing loomed closer, its form twisting and contorting like smoke. But just as it reached out, it let out a scream, a sound that pierced my ears and made the walls shake. Its body shimmered, faded, and then it was gone, leaving behind only a suffocating silence. The following nights were empty, quiet. I dared to hope that it was over, that the sinister entity had finally released me. I began sleeping peacefully again, convinced that the nightmare had finally ended. But as I sit here now writing this, I see it, a faint shadow, lingering just outside my window, watching, waiting. It's never gone, not really. It's just waiting, biding its time, ready to follow me again the moment I slip back into regret, into darkness. I know now that some shadows never leave. And no matter how much light I try to bring into my life, it will always be there, lurking just behind me, waiting for me to look back. I never believed in curses. Not really. Not until that night when the sound of a crying baby shattered the silence of the dark woods. It started like any other late autumn night, cold and damp, the air thick with that musty scent of fallen leaves. I'd agreed to meet up with my friend Eric at a cabin deep in the forest. We were both itching to get away from city life for a while, and the isolation was exactly what we needed. Or so I thought. Eric had already arrived by the time I got there, and the cabin was just as creaky and run down as he'd described it. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly with every gust of wind that slipped through the old walls. Despite the chill in the air, we were eager to settle in, light a fire, and crack open a few beers. But our plans took an unexpected turn around midnight. Just as we were about to turn in, there it was. A faint, muffled sound that carried on the breeze. A sound that had no place in the dead of night, let alone deep in the middle of nowhere. A baby crying. At first I thought I was hearing things. I glanced over at Eric, but his eyes were already wide, his face pale under the dim light. He'd heard it too. "Did you?" I stammered, unable to finish the sentence. He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. Yeah, I did." We both stood there, frozen, listening. The cries weren't the sharp wails of a newborn, but softer, like a baby in distress, like it had been crying for a long time. The kind of cry that prickles at the back of your mind, making you want to do something, anything, to help. "What the hell?" I whispered, glancing out the window. There was nothing but darkness beyond the glass, the trees casting twisted shadows under the sliver of moonlight. Eric's face twisted with worry. It's probably a fox or something, right? They can sound like babies. I tried to agree, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. There was something wrong about the sound, something almost too human. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, but the crying didn't stop. If anything, it was getting louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I found myself saying, "We should go check it out." Eric looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. But some instinct deep inside wouldn't let me ignore that sound. If there was even a chance, a slim, impossible chance, that a real baby was out there alone, lost, we couldn't just ignore it. Grabbing our flashlights, we stepped out into the chilly night. The darkness seemed thicker out here, pressing in on us from all sides. Our beams barely cut through it, casting long shadows that danced with every movement. The cries led us deeper and deeper into the woods, winding us through trails I didn't even know existed. The forest was unnervingly silent, save for the crying that seemed to echo off the trees, pulling us forward. "I don't like this," Eric muttered, glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone or something to be watching us. "This doesn't feel normal," he was right. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, and the temperature seemed to drop the farther we went. I could see my breath fogging in front of me, each puff hanging in the air longer than it should. But we kept moving, our steps crunching softly on the leaf-covered ground. The cries were louder now, almost desperate, like the baby was in pain. My chest tightened, and a strange dread began to gnaw at me, an instinctual urge to turn back. Just as I was about to suggest we give up, Eric froze. His flashlight beam had landed on something up ahead, something small and pale lying in the leaves. My heart hammered as I stepped closer, holding my breath. It was a bundle wrapped in a white cloth, barely visible in the darkness. I reached out slowly, my fingers trembling, and gently pulled the cloth back. There was nothing there. No baby, no sign of life. Just empty, tattered cloth, stained with something dark and foul-smelling. Eric took a shaky step back, his voice barely a whisper. What the hell is this?" The air around us felt wrong, thick and charged, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. And then, as if to mock us, the crying started again, this time much closer. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the shadows, but there was nothing there, only trees, twisted and looming, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like they were alive. "Let's get out of here," Eric said, his voice shaking. He didn't have to ask me twice. We turned and started back the way we came, our footsteps quickening with every passing second. But as we walked, I realized something was wrong. The forest felt different, like it was shifting around us. Trees that should have been familiar looked strange, twisted and wrong, as if they were closing in. Panic began to bubble up inside me. "Didn't we come from that way?" I asked, pointing to a path that seemed to vanish into darkness. Eric shook his head, looking just as lost as I felt. "I don't know, I don't remember." The crying was louder now, almost deafening, filling the air with that eerie, endless wail. My skin crawled, and a sick realization washed over me. We were no longer alone. I could feel it, something lurking just beyond the edge of the light, something that watched us, hungry and patient. We kept walking, faster and faster, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The trees closed in around us, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then, out of nowhere, Eric stumbled, his flashlight slipping from his grip and tumbling to the ground, casting wild, spinning shadows around us. I bent to help him, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the light's reach. It was small, almost childlike, with hollow eyes that stared at me with an intensity that pierced my soul. Its mouth was open, twisted into a grotesque shape, and from that mouth came the crying, an endless hollow sound that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond this world. "Run!" I shouted, yanking Eric to his feet. We bolted, adrenaline surging through us, our footsteps pounding against the earth. The cries grew louder, more frantic, as if the thing was following us, chasing us deeper into the darkness. Branches scratched at my face, snagging my clothes as we ran, but I didn't dare look back. The only thing that mattered was escaping, getting as far away from that sound as possible. Finally, the trees began to thin, and through the gaps, I saw a faint light. The cabin. We stumbled out of the woods, gasping for breath, and slammed the door shut behind us, locking it with trembling hands. The crying had stopped. The silence was almost deafening, pressing in on us as we stood there, hearts pounding, staring at each other with wide, terrified eyes. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. But later that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I thought I heard it again. A faint, distant cry, drifting through the night air. And this time, I knew better than to go looking for it. Ever since that night, the sound of a baby crying in the woods has haunted my dreams, pulling me back to that cursed forest again and again. I don't know what we saw, or what it wanted, but one thing is certain. Some things are meant to stay lost.